Welcome to this podcast from the Politics Shed. In this episode, I'm going to think about think tanks. In this podcast, I'll be looking at what think tanks are, how you might define them, what exactly they do, how they work, some case studies of think tanks in action, and we'll consider some debates about the benefits and indeed criticisms of think tanks. So first of all, what are think tanks? Well, they're rather oddly named, but on the other hand, it's quite useful. They do a lot of thinking, and they're a group of people. I don't know what the term tank conjures up for you, whether it's something rather warlike or something you might put things in. But if you imagine it like a fish tank, that sort of tank, then it's a collection of things, of people who have expertise. They can be described as universities without students, and indeed they have many of the attributes of a research department within a university. So they can be described as research organisations, or advocacy groups or advocacy organisations. They have certain characteristics in common. They tend to be non-governmental, autonomous, independent. They tend to be not-for-profit, and they may well have a distinctive perspective from which they argue or from which they produce research. In practical terms, you might find them housed within offices and buildings where experts gather. Some of them also work at universities, some are full-time. They're experts in economics and social policy and statistics, and they conduct research into social problems. In effect, what they're doing is rather like miners. They're mining for expert ideas, well-researched policy alternatives that governments or other organisations, but primarily governments, can use. Governments are hungry for knowledge about what to do. Indeed, probably the most fearful question a politician is asked is, well, what would you do then? Criticism, as you've no doubt discovered yourself in arguments, criticism is easier than coming up with solutions of your own. In opposition particularly, parties are hungry for ideas, how to deal with unemployment, how to reduce crime, how to stimulate the economy. Too much taxation? Too little taxation? There seem to be, particularly in our less ideological times, debates over the practical necessity for policy ideas, things that can be done to reduce crime, to look after the elderly, to make the health service run more efficiently. Parties produce ideas, people do, journalists, people have ideas in their own heads, and all of these filter into political parties. But the ideas that might have the most influence is if they are backed by experts, people who have conducted detailed research into a particular policy alternative. So think of think tanks as trading in two kinds of knowledge. Generally, well-researched knowledge that is impressively produced by experts, like might be found in a court of law. The jury sits and listens to experts on one side, experts on the other. One convinces you that the defendant could not have committed the crime, the other convinces you that he surely could have done. They each have impressive skills, abilities, academic qualifications, and reference all sorts of detailed research. The defence or the prosecution use the experts to support their particular point of view, innocence or guilt. The jury, if I keep this metaphor going, maybe the electorate, are persuaded by the power of the expert and the detailed research he cites. The second kind of knowledge that think tanks trade in, then, is the kind of knowledge that supports the views of political parties. Parties of the right, or conservative parties, might look for free market solutions to problems. The ways in which supply and demand and market forces might make things more efficient. Schools, hospitals, the police, or prisons. Parties of the left might look for interventionist policies. The ways in which government can intervene, manage the economy better, take over parts of the economy, and show that this works best. So whether the ideology comes from the left or the right, from libertarian, free market, or from socialist, or from statist, or from views that governments can work or governments should be left aside, think tanks might well provide the expert witness to support that case. Generating expert knowledge and using that, or trading it as it were, for influence on politicians is something that many pressure groups use. But pressure groups will also have publicity campaigns, membership drives, lobbying. But think tanks are specialists. They specialise in expert knowledge. From what I've said so far, you can probably already begin to see how this might lead to some criticisms, that figures don't lie, but liars can figure. In other words, you can generate expert knowledge to prove most points, to justify many opinions, and they can seem very persuasive. More of that later. So now we come to what think tanks do. Well, already I've answered part of that. They generate ideas based upon research. They harness the skills and capacities of experts, and they conduct research into data. They compare different policies. They compare different options in different countries. They produce reports. That's why they're sometimes called brains trusts or ideas factories. In politics, they're involved in the policy formulation stage. So it's rather useful right now to think about what policies are. A policy is a clear proposal. Governments might have long-term objectives, ideological beliefs, a fairer society, the redistribution of wealth, government intervention, free market ideologies. But policies are specific things. They'll go into manifestos that they're going to do. They might be called promises. It's the policy of this government to raise a tax here, the policy of this government to reform this particular thing, to change it. These will be clear and concrete. Therefore, the policy formulation stage is how these proposals, clear proposals of what we are going to do if we become the government, what we will do next if we are the government, are formed. It's here that pressure groups offer help. They give the government something it desperately desires. Expert knowledge from their point of view, not the kind of neutral support that the civil service might provide, but something that says, we will help you do your general objective and show you specific proposals that will work towards that objective, and give you the arguments you can use to support it. We'll give you options, data, facts, arguments you can use in your campaigns to support this policy option. Think tanks make two claims. First, to be experts. They are, as I said earlier, the expert witnesses. Secondly, their claim is to be independent. Like the expert standing in the court of law, he's simply from a university. He doesn't care whether the man is guilty or innocent. He's simply someone interested in forensics. A man or woman with expertise. Therefore, they present themselves to the jury as neutral, guided by knowledge, the objectivity of the scientist. Think tanks try to wear this kind of clothing. We're simply experts. This is where the facts have led us. They do this even when they clearly do have a distinct ideological viewpoint. Well, this is where the facts take us, but they just take us in the direction that we believe. There's a kind of cognitive dissonance with think tanks. They're independent, guided by facts, and yet they have a particular point of view. This is why many think tanks are not clear about who funds them. Who's paying the salaries, the expenses, the rent on those offices? Who funds them and where do they get their money from? As you might understand with any organisation, the people who are paying, that is, the piper may call the tune, the people who are paying for something. So who funds them does expose how their independence can be something of an illusion. In the website Who Funds You, you can see an analysis of pressure groups and think tanks based upon how transparent they are. As with the number of pressure groups, so the number of think tanks has increased substantially in the last half-century or so, certainly since the 1980s. Sometimes Mrs. Thatcher and her desire to seek alternatives to what might be called establishment views She was challenging the post-war consensus, Keynesian economics, big government, which had dominated politics since the end of the Second World War. Her desire to find an alternative, economics, led her to seek advice outside of the civil service, outside of what she saw as the establishment. The rise in the number of think tanks, there's more than 200 operating in the UK today, is partly a result of the complexity of government. Governments are expected to do more things, about more things. This has been a general trend since the 19th century onwards, and is accelerated towards the end of the 20th century and into the new century. Information technology and the ability to gather data, gathering of data, harnessing of data-led information, to win elections, to prove policy points, to give ideas and policies the attributes of scientific research, authenticity and authority. Then there's a general crisis of confidence in what governments are capable of doing, and a desire to look to those who think different things. Many governments arrive in power, as it were, casting themselves as outsiders, coming in to take on the establishment. Fresh ideas, brought in from where? Well, from Tufton Street, more of them later, from pressure groups. In some ways, I alluded to this earlier, what we're seeing is the end of the ideological division of politics, left and right, with different views, broad ideological plans of how society might run, and a rise of a new pragmatism, of left and right, of new Labour and conservatism. Parties now don't argue over changing the world or different visions of society, but instead, who will make the best managers? For managers, you need policies, strategies, and tactics. So welcome to the world of the policy wonk, the expert who crunches numbers, whether it's to win an election or to develop policy for the health service or for the economy. Mrs. Thatcher once said that she was tired of people bringing her problems. What she wanted was solutions. Well, that's what think tanks do. They give you solutions. Sometimes politicians set up their own think tanks. Tony Blair set up the Strategy Unit for Blue Skies Thinking, hiring John Birt, ex-director of the BBC, to think the, blue skies things, presumably original ideas for political problems. In the 1970s, Edward Heath set up the Central Policy Review Staff. Again, a think tank within the government set up by the government. Of course, the civil service have thousands of people devoted to developing policy ideas. But again, as I said before, the attraction of the outsider is going to give you that blue sky thinking. Challenge the establishment. Some think tanks have a very close relationship with political parties. For example, the Centre for Social Justice, a right-wing think tank which looks at free market solutions. Mrs. Thatcher favoured the Adam Smith Institute. There's something of a revolving door when it comes to think tanks. Politicians come from think tanks, sometimes they return to them when they finish their political career. David Willetts, once described as Two Brains Willetts, has worked on and off for the Resolution Foundation for many years. Labour politicians Patricia Hewitt and David Miliband were associated with the Institute for Public Policy Research. You might argue that think tanks are a good training ground for politicians. However, you might suggest they also provide politicians who have a particularly theoretical view and managerialist view of politics, which can, as we shall see later with the example of Liz Truss, come unstuck. Now let's look at a couple of think tanks in action. How influential have they been? A good case study might be Ian Duncan Smith's Centre for Social Justice. In 2004, Ian Duncan Smith, Tory politician and backbencher at the time, and ex-leader of the Conservative Party, set up a think tank in response to his own view that people were becoming dependent on welfare benefits. A right-wing think tank looked at social security reform. When Ian Duncan Smith became the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, an idea from that think tank became a policy. This policy was the bedroom tax. It wasn't called the bedroom tax. It was actually a reduction in subsidies for people who, living in public housing or council houses or council flats, found their family size had fallen as children left home, would have their housing benefits cut, forcing them to move to smaller accommodation. It was pragmatic, it was ruthless, and it was highly utilitarian. Ideally, everyone should live in a house that suits exactly their size of family. Of course, that doesn't take into account that they're human beings. Ian Duncan Smith, as Work and Pensions Secretary, again implemented a recommendation of the Centre for Social Justice, one of the most dramatic reforms or simplifications of the benefit system in the post-war years. Universal credit. This is where, to avoid people becoming trapped in the poverty trap, that is to say, as their work income increased, their benefits were cut, and they were actually worse off, therefore trapping them on benefits. So, benefits would taper off as their work income increased. While widely admired for its intention to avoid the poverty trap, its implementation was harsh, since people had to work for a month without benefits at all before they could receive universal credit. It was a policy, though theoretically pragmatic, took no account of the slender means of people in genuine poverty. Housing policy, again, was influenced by Minister Grant Shapps, who was associated with the Policy Exchange. The Policy Exchange, a centre-right think tank again, argued for a policy of right to move, so that people in public housing would be given the priority if they needed to relocate to areas for a new job. This would become a criteria. The mobility of labour, again, pragmatic and efficient. The Policy Exchange also generated studies which showed that public service workers were generally paid more than workers in the private sector, and argued for a rebalancing of the economy, which led in many ways to the policies during the period of austerity after 2010, in which public service workers for many years received pay rises that were under the level of inflation, steadily building to the great discontent and sense of injustice that led to multiple strikes in 2022. Now let's look at another case study. This time it's the one related to the implosion of the Liz Truss government, that very short-lived premiership, and the influence of pressure groups that are based in 55 Tufton Street. 55 Tufton Street is a kind of K Street for London pressure groups. K Street being the rather posh street in Washington DC, where multiple interest groups and pressure groups and lobbyists are based. 55 Tufton Street, you can find the Centre for Policy Studies, the Institute for Economic Affairs, and the Taxpayers Alliance. All of these are right-of-centre, free market pressure groups that have had an enormous influence on the Conservative Party for the last 10 years. The Centre for Policy Studies, founded in 1974 by Margaret Thatcher, Keith Joseph and Alfred Sherman. It describes itself as Britain's leading centre-right think tank. Our mission is to develop a new generation of conservative thinking, built around promoting enterprise, ownership and prosperity. In other words, free market solutions. They're rated as E grade by Who Funds Them, the website that looks at think tanks. E grade means they're one of the most opaque. They don't acknowledge any funders for their income. It is the Centre for Policy Studies that generated the ideas behind Liz Truss's mini-budget, which might be why the campaign group led by donkeys hung a sign outside 55 Tufton Street saying the UK economy was crushed here. In 2011, Liz Truss founded a backbench group called the Free Enterprise Group, over 40 MPs who supported the ideas of the Institute for Economic Affairs, another Tufton Street think tank. They published a book Britannia, Unchained, which outlined many of the theoretical ideas and positions she would enact when she became Prime Minister. Notably, trying to stimulate the economy to be more efficient by creating a low-tax economy, modelling the British economy on the success of places like Singapore: low taxes, free enterprise, and small government. And indeed, when Liz Truss became Prime Minister, after a lengthy leadership battle, she appointed her friend and fellow believer policies of the Institute for Economic Affairs, Kwasi Kwarteng, as Chancellor, and they immediately set about, in short order, enacting the theoretical policies of a low-tax economy, with disastrous effects, leading to her first sacking the Chancellor and then her own resignation, and making the subsequent budget of Jeremy Hunt altogether more unpleasant for the British people. What lesson can we learn from this? Well, this leads to the question of our think tanks good for democracy, which of course is just a subset of our pressure groups and interest groups and lobbyists good for democracy. Many of the arguments are similar, so let's outline them one at a time. First, let's consider the argument that think tanks bring clever, well-informed people into politics. They are, after all, as we said earlier, sometimes described as universities without students, research institutions. Therefore, they produce experts, people who know a thing or two about the, difficulties and complexities of social policy. Better informed than politicians, they make excellent special advisors or SPADs. There's plenty of evidence that people who have come from think tanks have made their way into politics and influenced government policy in some ways more effectively than many backbench MPs. Take Adam Memon in the Treasury. Adam Memon was appointed as a special advisor to the Chancellor and kept the job when Kwasi Kwarteng became Chancellor, and as of December 2022 is still there. Memon was head of economics research at the Centre for Policy Studies, the CPS, from 2014 to 2015. The Centre for Policy Studies, based at 55 Tufton Street and part of the Tufton Street network, and describes itself as responsible for developing the bulk of the policy agenda that became known as Thatcherism. Another example would be James Price, who became Chief of Staff in the Cabinet Office, the very centre of government itself. Price worked for the Taxpayers Alliance, again based in Tufton Street, from 2016 to 2018. He was a policy analyst and then a campaigns manager. The Taxpayers Alliance was founded by Matthew Elliott, who subsequently was head of the Vote Leave campaign. And finally, let's take the example of Giles Dilnot. Giles Dilnot, a former BBC broadcaster, is another SPAD, or Specialist Advisor, hired by the Foreign Office. After leaving broadcasting in 2016, Dilnot was hired as Head of Communications for the Mayfair-based Legatum Institute, a think tank which advocates for free market economics. This institute has been described as the think tank of choice for Brexiteers. These are just 3 examples of people who, experts in their field, have gone through research institutions to become advisors in the very centre of government. You can see the objection already. They have a particular point of view. They believe in free market economics. They believe in Brexit. They're hardly likely to speak truth to power, the old civil service idea, that you have to have the ability to say what needs to be said to politicians, tell them when they've got it wrong, not simply be yes men, or encourage them in directions that are really not helpful, which maybe is what exactly happened under the short-lived premiership of Liz Truss and the disastrous mini-budget. It may also be possible the bright young things, the clever people of the think tanks, moving as they do from education, from academia, to research institutions, to politics, have little real experience. In so doing, they exert a kind of mystical influence over politicians who see their qualifications and their fresh ideas as exciting, since they have not been tempered by the cynicism or pragmatism of years in politics. A second argument that is used generally of interest groups and lobbyists, but also of think tanks, is that they are part of a pluralist society where multiple ideas are tested, considered, they clash with alternate views, and they create a vibrant and experimental laboratory of social policy. Good ideas generated, new ideas, fresh thinking, blue sky opinions. Think tanks might, for example, involve people in politics, wider communities, business organisations, civil groups, and draw them into politics, creating a wider set of voices. They might well include more young people. The average age of backbench MPs and politicians tends to be older than the general population. Think tanks, however, could be places of youth and vitality. They can also create a demand for change and suggest new ideas, and those ideas pick up a kind of momentum, and they might offer an inspiring vision of something different. In general, think tanks rely on an elite model of influence which targets policymakers in government and sees this as the best route to achieving change. Elite models of influence involve using a mix of insider strategies, forming relationships with policymakers at the policy development stage, offering expertise and help and assistance, and also outsider strategies, i.e. the media, campaigns, changing public opinion. Clearly, the extent to which insider status becomes exclusionary and excludes a range of ideas, excluding think tanks who are not favourable to government ideology, and prioritising those think tanks whose suggestions suit government policy, points towards a danger. And the danger is that some pressure groups and some think tanks exert a disproportionate influence on the elites and policy making. Think tanks can play an expert advisory role by working with government officials and parliamentary committees in the House of Commons and the European Parliament. They can act as representatives from the business community and civil society. But the influence of some pressure groups is, as we've said, possibly disproportionate. And their overly theoretical approach, not grounded in pragmatism, can lead to dangerously dogmatic policies. The conservative centre-right think tanks, such as the Centre for Policy Studies and the Policy Exchange, have been highly effective at getting their policy recommendations written into government reports and influencing government decisions. As one interviewee, quoted by the Think Tank Landscape website, stated, "Policy Exchange is probably the one think tank that works at the intersection of economics, politics, foreign policy and development, and has a high degree of access and receptiveness within the Conservative Party. If you're not talking to the guys at Policy Exchange, you're not part of the conversation." Now let's look at another argument for think tanks. Think tanks, along with pressure groups and lobbyists to some degree, help to create an open society. A society where transparency and accountability are enhanced. Transparency and accountability are important features of any democracy and help the efficiency of government. Think, for instance, of governments which suppress public debate and suppress a full understanding, even of their own society. Take, for instance, the example of China in the latter part of 2022, veering radically between a draconian shutdown policy against COVID to an opening up policy which allowed COVID to spread rapidly through the population, which had been only imperfectly vaccinated, sees that the government refused to acknowledge its own failures, refused to listen to critical voices, and followed its own centrist, uncritical, and dogmatic approach. China, then, and indeed all repressive societies, are examples of the way in which democracy and pluralism and openness and transparency are seen as essential to limiting the power of government and exposing their failures, as well as enhancing the quality of their policies. A useful example is the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Founded more than a century ago by the philanthropist and industrialist Joseph Rowntree, it campaigns on issues of education, the environment, but primarily poverty. It was, between 2015 and 2021, the most cited or referred to think tank in government policy documents. 157 government policy documents referred to findings or research from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, mostly concerning social policy and education. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation have been providing expert support to government for a century to combat poverty. Even right of centre, generally libertarian on economics, think tanks such as the Legatum Institute mentioned earlier or the Resolution Foundation have warned the government of Rishi Sunak that poverty is likely to rise dramatically in the years ahead and have advised the government to allow benefits to keep pace with inflation. And these are useful examples of speaking truth to power. Another useful example of speaking truth to power is the think tank the Institute for Fiscal Studies, an independent group of economics experts who generally run their eyes over the government's books and cast a critical view on economic policy. During Liz Truss's campaign to be the leader of the Conservative Party, as she outlined her economic policies, and shortly after her short-lived mini-budget, the Institute for Fiscal Studies was withering in its criticism, suggesting that the numbers simply didn't add up and it would be impossible to sustain the £100 billion worth of borrowing that would be necessary. While this was the accepted view of most economists, the Institute for Fiscal Studies carries considerable authority and is seen as generally independent and expert. However, these favourable examples can be countered by arguments we drew upon earlier, considering their rather opaque funding, particularly the funding many think tanks get from large corporations, such as the Institute for Economic Affairs, which receives funding from energy companies and has produced reports which are critical of the theory of climate change and have emphasised the economic necessity for continuing with fossil fuels. Just as in the 1960s, tobacco companies were able to promote research into the lack of harm, or the harmlessness, that is, of tobacco, so in the 1980s, 90s, and the beginning of this century, the big energy corporations funded research to discredit climate change, and they continue to do so. So overall then, just how influential are think tanks? And what is the nature of their influence? For good or bad? You could look at the failure of the Liz Truss government as a case study. For a few brief months, the government of Great Britain seemed to have followed a very narrow policy path, one widely criticised by some, but supported by a small group of ideologically driven economists and theorists, largely from a small network of think tanks. This narrowing of policy options may be seen to be one of the downsides of think tanks. Governments rely on the kind of voices they think will tell them the things they want to hear. This will exclude others and will encourage them into narrow policy directions. Therefore, think tanks will mitigate against consensus politics and possibly against pragmatism. Harold Wilson once said that politics is the art of the possible. Well, think tanks are the art of telling politicians they can do what they want, that it is in fact possible. However, you have to place this in a context. After all, the Liz Truss government was short-lived. The ideas of those think tanks and Tufton Street and the Tufton Street Network was short-lived as well. And after all, the think tanks only exert influence when they're called upon by governments who wish to use their expertise. They are in fact guns for hire. Rather than think tanks influencing government, governments pick and choose from the think tanks that they wish to be influenced by. And as soon as the government loses power or returns to opposition, the think tank's influence significantly declines. What is very clear is that think tanks have access, far more access than me and you, far more access than many organisations with many millions of members. They trade their expertise by giving politicians the arguments and the research and the statistics and the data that will support what they want to do. In that sense, their influence certainly outweighs their numbers and certainly outweighs the influence of the average voter. What impact then do think tanks have? How effective are they? What are people getting for their money? Well, they may have a short-term influence over a government's decision-making, but it's likely that their influence is rather long-term, since they may influence public opinion. They might influence political elites. They may influence the way people talk in pubs and bars and on the street. They may shape the general political conversation of a particular time. They may feed into the media. They're certainly a great source of headlines. A think tank publishes a study which suggests something rather different or radical. That certainly provides a headline on a newspaper, a trail for a radio segment. So their impact is somewhat hard to measure. But rather like fashion models on a catwalk in Paris or London, the clothes may be rather difficult to wear in ordinary life, may be somewhat expensive and impractical. But a practical version, a less expensive version, turns up in Marks and Spencer's or online at affordable prices, made of washable material. But influenced by the general idea that was seen on the catwalk in the high fashion designs. So, the academic research of pressure groups and the academic research of think tanks may have a long-term influence on what we are all thinking and saying. If you get the chance, look at the website for another think tank. Cast from Clay, it's called. It's a think tank formed after the EU referendum by people concerned about the lack of understanding of expert knowledge and how the population could be easily swayed by narrow interpretations of somewhat dubious facts. Think tanks can generate arguments which seem plausible. They are specious. They seem plausible, can even be persuasive, but are ultimately false, such as the enormous benefits that would befall to the NHS once Britain had left the European Union. Many of these figures generated by think tanks. The Cast from Clay website shows research they've conducted into the popular understanding of politics, and they promote ways in which this could be improved. One piece of research shows that surveys indicate that only 1% of the population can name a think tank. That think tank is generally the Adam Smith Institute, famous from its Thatcherite days. Mostly then, the population as a whole are oblivious to the impact of think tanks, and the impact of think tanks can be considerable. Their funding is opaque, their financial backers generally corporate, and their method of influence elitist. They are one of many policy influencers, political parties, politicians themselves, lobby groups and voluntary organisations, public opinion and newspapers and the media, expert groups, universities, research organisations, banks and corporations, and think tanks. In a broad and open, pluralistic society, their influence may be considerable and indeed disproportionate in some cases, and at times think tanks can gain an undue access, even an unhelpful access to power. However, it's also true that if we didn't have think tanks, we'd probably have to invent them. Their expertise in a complex policy environment is invaluable and useful to governments who are expected to come up with answers to just about everything. There's no right answer to are think tanks good or bad. However, one can't help feeling that the think tanks that reside at 55 Tufton Street have a lot to answer for. You have been listening to the Politics Shed podcast, which supports the work of the Politics Shed website, a free textbook for all people interested, studying, or otherwise engaged in politics. Thank you for listening.